You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined once again by Jarrett Walker to talk about the release of the second edition of his influential book, Human Transit. We chat about Ursula Le Guin, expanding access to opportunity, and thoughts on anger as a response to change. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks infinitely to all the transit planners, bus drivers, advocates, and friends that support the show. To join this merry gang of zoning misfits and transit lovers, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month will get you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month will get you one of our transportation scarves. We appreciate everyone's support over the last year and look forward to sharing more episodes in 2024. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Also, if you want to support the show in other ways, check out the show notes in your podcatcher or go to theoverheadwire.com to find links to our Cars Are Cholesterol merch, our Talking Headways book club shop at bookshop.org, or sign up for a 2-week free trial of our 18-year-old daily newsletter and archive. Thanks for supporting, and this year make sure to listen to this space for opportunities for happy hours, live performances, and updated information on coming attractions. And now, let's get back to the show. Jarrett Walker, welcome back to the Talking Headways podcast.
Hey, thanks very much. It's good to be back.
Yeah, it's good to see you again. For folks that might not be familiar with your work or haven't listened to episode 177 from 2018, can you tell folks a little bit about yourself?
I am a consultant who specializes in helping cities and public transit agencies think about the design and layout of public transit networks. Mostly what we do is the redesign of bus networks, but we provide a variety of other kinds of consulting around public transit planning. I've been doing this for about 30 years, and I've had my own firm for 14 years now, Jarrett Walker and Associates. But I am also the author of a book called Human Transit, which is an attempt to make transit issues accessible and interesting to a general reader and to help people think through their options when they're thinking about what kinds of opinions about public transit they should have.
Well, so we're going to talk a little bit about Human Transit in the second edition in a little bit, and we'll go through that pretty extensively. And actually, I just realizing that, we never really talked about the first book. We never had you on to talk about the first book. We talked about a lot of other things when I chatted with you, but we never really talked about the first book. But first, I wanted to ask you about something completely different entirely, because I've seen you tweet about this a lot. And unfortunately, Ursula Le Guin passed away. And I've seen a lot of you talking about how important she was to you and you're thinking about life and things like that. I'm curious why her writing was so important to you, and especially as somebody who hasn't never read her work, I'm interested in why it was important to you to share your experiences reading her books, or at least talking about why she was such an important author.
Oh, there's a great deal there, because I've been reading Ursula Le Guin for 40 years. But let's start by saying that a great deal of science fiction, especially in her generation, in the late 20th century, was about how cool technology will be and all the cool places technology will take us. And that the future is a place, I'll butcher the quotation, but she said things to the effect of, the basic idea of a great deal of male science fiction is that the future is a place that we will conquer and tame and suburbanize. And I think she would look at something like Star Trek, for all of its idealism, as being fundamentally about the promulgation of a middle-class American suburban lifestyle across the universe. And her view was that science fiction is about the present, and it is about other ways that things could be. And it is a way of thinking about the present and thinking about our own moral choices by imagining other ways that things could be. And she was the first, I think, great anthropological science fiction writer, in that her interest was first and primarily and foremost human beings, the construction of human societies. Many of her books are actually written from the point of view of an anthropologist, from the point of view of a scientist exploring a fictional culture that she has invented. But it is always about different ways that we could be, and it is always about holding open for people the possibility of there being many different ways that human beings could be. For people who haven't read her work at all, guessing from the fact that you're listening to this podcast that you're interested in public policy, I'd suggest starting with her novel, The Dispossessed. which is a 1974 novel that imagines an anarchist society. And the contradictions and challenges that she develops as she imagines this society are remarkably relevant. I just reread The Dispossessed again, and I was struck that in the 1990s, which was a rather utopian period when we thought we had permanently solved a number of the fundamental problems of history, I remember thinking that The Dispossessed was rather dated. But when I just read it last month, it read like it had been written yesterday. It read like it was all about the crises of the moment. So I hope that people who are involved in public policy will continue reading that book.
So then it sounds like you've taken a lot of that and brought it forward into your thinking about transportation as well, and into parts of your book too.
Sure. In that the fundamental conflict that I am in with so many people in this field is that I believe that this is a moral topic that is about making moral choices in understanding of their consequences. And many people working in this field believe that this is a technological topic where the key question is simply what is going to be invented and how do we respond to those inventions. Much of the discourse about public transit assumes that we as citizens are fundamentally passive receivers of technological events, that the inventors are in the driver's seat, and that we will have to live in whatever world that they invent, and we hope it will be a nice one. But this has been going on for a long time, and we live in the world that our great-great-grandparents invented in very much the same spirit as today's inventors are inventing things. So techno-utopianism is quite old now, and it's very important that people have studied the history. It's so important that people be reading, Peter Norton's wonderful historical books about just how we got here and why, and just how old-fashioned techno-hype is, how old-fashioned the idea is that technology is going to fix everything is. It's been sold to us on a large sort of industrial scale for more than a century now, and goes back, in some ways quite a bit further than that. So I am a bit of an iconoclast in this space in believing that what I do, which is transit planning, is entirely a matter of helping communities reach choices about what to do that reflect their values, and not ever intimidating people with telling them that something or other is coming and that they simply have to respond to it.
That seems to happen quite a bit. I've just posted a story about Nashville and the potential for, investment in their transit system. In the last election, lost in part because there were a lot of folks saying that, the future is self-driving cars. And so why do we need this anachronistic old technology that seems to work pretty well in places that are urban and dense and cities all over the world?
Absolutely. The transit agency in Silicon Valley itself, in Santa Clara County, California, had a great deal of difficulty getting bus lanes developed because various cities along the way, the argument would frequently take that form. So self-driving cars, despite not having been perfected, and despite not being a solution to the problems that transit is a solution to, are already directly affecting your commute by virtue of undermining investments in transit and undermining support for it. And that's one of the main things that I'm trying to confront in the new edition of the book.
Well, let's talk about the book, Human Transit, the second edition. What made you want to go back and revisit the book again after such a successful run with the first edition?
It wasn't my first idea. I was trying to think about how to do a new book. But finally, we came around to the notion that, in fact, the reason you revise a book is that the book is mostly still fine. If a book is not basically still fine, then you write a new book and that sort of erases the old one. But because the book is basically still fine, I wanted to respond to the fact that because of what people have been told and what people have learned from the media, a book about public transit published in 2011, people will assume is out of date because we are bombarded by messages that everything is changing. And so many things have obviously happened since 2011, particularly with technology development and then, of course, with the effect of the pandemic, that it became clear to me that if the book was going to continue to function, it needed to be updated anyway, just so that it looked new. But having decided to do that, and inevitably I started with the idea, I'll just add a couple chapters here. It won't be very much work. And I ended up fundamentally working through and revising the whole thing to some extent. I'd say the book is about 35% new now, and, the rest of it looking pretty much like the first edition. But there were several main things. Obviously, we had to talk about technology hype. We had to talk about the way that inventors were promoting various false narratives that needed to be confronted about how public transit was obsolete because of something that was about to be invented. And that had to be taken on at the right altitude and worked through in detail. And so we do that. And so there's a lot of work in the early part of the book in establishing what is the thing that only public transit can do and that is not going to be replaced by any conceivable invention. And that thing is the efficient use of space, in addition to a whole bunch of other important things that it does now. The second thing was that there had particularly been a lot of hype and confusion around on-demand or microtransit, or there are many brand names for this thing, which is one reason to be suspicious of it. Not because anything is really new there. Demand-responsive or on-demand transit has existed for decades, but it has been considerably streamlined by the addition of much, much better communications technology, which has allowed it to run much more efficiently. My dispute with the microtransit marketers is not about whether this is a useful product. It does have its uses, and we use it in our plans. My dispute with them is in the claim that they have somehow reinvented public transit. On-demand transit, which means transit services that do something different based on what someone asks, are an extremely inefficient use of operating dollars, and as a result, they are a niche tool for some very, very specific use cases. They are not a transformative thing that's going to, change what public transit is across most environments. And so I had to put some energy into that. Then I wanted to expand a bit more on network design, which is what I do. I also wanted to add more of a discussion about how we think about transit riders and transit customers, because I had noticed more and more that the confusions that I was encountering in going from city to city and working with communities and obviously interacting with their assumptions and prejudices, that significant harm was being done by the notion that transit customers can be divided into a group of people who we think of as dependent on public transit and other people who choose public transit. And the purpose of that frame, that binary frame, is to tell yourself, well, the dependent people are stuck with us, so the only way we'll grow is by attracting the choice rider. So we should focus on luxury. We should focus on things that will attract somebody out of their car. And this leads to, very, very premium commuter services. And it leads to building trains instead of using buses because, choice riders supposedly won't ride buses. And I think it has been really one of the fundamental confusions that's underlying in public transit planning in the last few decades in the U.S. What it does is to obviously, it becomes a way for fortunate people to present themselves as the typical customer, to present themselves as the person around whom planning should be done. And the fact is that our elites, our decision makers, are, by virtue of being elite, are unusual and are not actually the average person around whom we should be planning. So we needed to talk through all that, and there's a new chapter that works through all of those issues, starting out with a useful exclamation by Elon Musk that I use as the hook on that chapter. But finally, kind of at the root of all of it, as we think about the question of what is success, how are we defining success in transit, what is the thing we could measure that captures what we're trying to do? And I've been saying for years, there's much less consensus about this than people assume. And that one of the reasons why transit policy is so difficult is that there are so many different goals mixed up in it that people are not necessarily doing the work of reconciling. And so I figured out in the mid-teens that the thing that I had been thinking about all my life and trying to do all my career with transit was actually to expand access to opportunity. What I wanted was for more people to be able to go to more places in less time so that they could have more choices in their lives and do more things. And so I started talking about that in probably 2012, 2013, There's a little bit of a hint of it in the first edition of the book, but I didn't understand it very well then, and I think I describe it much more thoroughly and much more clearly now. And also, we have developed in the last decade the analytic tools. I mean, the industry has developed the analytic tools necessary to really start going places with this idea. So there's a new chapter that really puts that at the foundation. And then all of the other arguments are, revised to refer to that.
That leads me to so many different questions, but the first one is around that idea of the elite projection. And this question I ask fairly frequently of folks is, when you go somewhere, when you go to a city and start working with folks there, like how many of the folks that you're working with, whether they're board members, whether they're transit agency people, whether they're people who are in the room when you're having these sessions with folks, how many of them actually take transit to start with? And how many actually use the service that they put out when you start the process of trying to reimagine a bus network?
I make a point of not asking that. And the reason is that I don't want people who do not use transit to feel that I am diminishing their input. It is important that the transit system be owned and valued by the entire community, including many people for whom it is not the logical way to travel. And so I want to be careful about, it's easy to say, what's wrong is just that transit riders aren't in charge. No, it's more complicated than that. Because you do need to have leadership that has access to the levers of power in the community. You need to have leadership that reflects the diversity of the community. And you need to be encouraging people who don't use transit to nevertheless care about it. So when I go into a meeting and somebody stands up and say, I just want to show of hands how many people got here on transit, I always cringe, because the people who didn't get here on transit are welcome here. And what I hear always is a subtle implication that they're kind of not, or that they have, in some sense, less authority. What is true is that people who don't use transit don't understand it as well, and will make certain understandable mistakes as they bring their own frame of reference to it and expect it to work like whatever the thing is that they are an expert in. And that's really what the book is trying to do to a large extent, is engage and help people understand that this isn't a priesthood. I never want you to believe me because I'm an expert. I want you to believe me because I'm making sense. And what I try in the book is to explain what you need to know in order to know what transit planners know, so that you can actually make good decisions about transit. Because most of the people coming to this field, understandably, you get appointed to the transit board. You're waiting in line to run for city council. You may not be all that interested in transit. They put you on the transit board. You do your best, but, you may not really know much about it. And you may not have any experience with it. And so it's tempting to bring whatever frame of reference you have, whether it's architecture or economics or business management or civil rights or whatever frame you have, and just expect transit to fit that frame. And it often doesn't. There's actually things you have to understand about how transit works if you're going to use it to deliver whatever kind of outcome you care about. And, I feel like it's sort of my role to help people, give people those tools.
You call yourself a plumber in the book.
Yes.
Was that the first idea that came to mind?
So the plumber metaphor is a way of isolating expertise from values and clarifying that, in my view, and many consultants are not like me, but in my view, it is incumbent on me as a consultant to offer my expertise without constraining you by my values, because your values may be different. I'm coming to your community. I don't live in your community. I'm not a voter in your community. I'm here to understand what your community is trying to do. But the hard part is that the expert gets to ask you questions that clarify what your values are, and some of those questions may be difficult. So I say in the book, say you hire a man to fix your plumbing. He goes to work under your sink, and then he comes back holding a wrench, and he says, look, I could just glue this all together like this, and it'd be good for another year or two, and it'd cost you $50. Or I could rip out the whole assembly and rebuild it just like new, and that would cost you $600 and take me a week. But then it would be good as new. And so we all have been in that moment, and we understand that the plumber is giving us a choice, cheap or durable. And he knows you want both. That's not one of the options. We all understand that in that situation, that he's giving you an or choice, right? Well, transit planning is just full of those or choices between values. The most common one is that you have to choose between how much you value the goal of ridership and how much you value the goal of what I call coverage, which is making sure that everyone in the city has a little something. Because the math of transit tells us that we get ridership by concentrating service in places where the demand is greatest and not trying to serve places of low demand. And that's how you get the highest ridership overall for your investment. And if instead you're expected to go everywhere, because everywhere there are people who have needs, or because we pay taxes too, or because, you need to go to every city council district, or whatever excellent reason there is to provide coverage, there's nothing wrong with coverage. My point about coverage is just that it's the opposite of ridership. And so in our studies, when we're doing network plans, we are often asking boards to actually tell us, what percentage of your operating budget do you actually want to spend on the goal of ridership? Tell us that, and then we'll make sure that that percentage of the resources are going into things that we can tell you are high ridership services. The rest will go to coverage. And if you can tell us where that split is, and of course we lead a conversation, we usually draw some conceptual networks that show what the network would look like if you went different directions. If you go in the direction of ridership, there'll be more frequency, but fewer routes going fewer places. If you go in the direction of coverage, there'll be more routes going everywhere. Everyone will be near something, but there'll be less frequency. They'll be less likely to be coming when you need them. That's the sort of thing where I just frame the question and stand back in the way that the plumber is standing back. And the thing everyone recognizes about the plumber situation is that when the plumber is standing there asking you his question, you cannot just pick up a magazine and start talking about how you'd like your kitchen to feel. None of those speeches that you want to give at that moment are going to have any effect on the plumber. You have to answer his question exactly the way he asked it. Cheap or durable, you've got to answer that. And so that's the point of the plumber. The point of the plumber is that you have to bring your values into contact with reality, and that's what I'm trying to help you do in this process.
At the end of the book, though, you talk about it's not always or, it's a spectrum, right?
It is a spectrum, yeah. So the plumber metaphor is a little misleading in that it's a binary thing, when in fact, what I'm asking you is a spectrum question. So how do you want to divide your resources between these two goals? So I'm not saying that you have to choose an entirely ridership system or an entirely coverage system. Nobody chooses that. It's a question of where you come down on the spectrum. And an elected official's first impulse is to just, give me rhetoric about balance or whatever, and just give me words. And no, we need to cut through and get to the number. How much do you want to spend on this? How much do you want to spend on that? It goes to the urban planner Brent Todorant's dictum that if you want to understand the values of an organization, you should ignore their vision statement and look at their budget, because that's exactly what a budget is. It's the numbers. How important is this goal? How important is this goal? The budget tells you.
You also mentioned access before, and I think that's something that on the show we've tried to talk more about and tried to explain a little bit more, because I think that's a really important part of the change in discussion that's been happening over the last 10, 15 years or so. And so the idea in the book of walls is really interesting to me too, in thinking about that access question, right? So the idea that there are travel times where people will take for certain activities, whether it's 15 minutes for an errand or 30 minutes for a commute, which is Marchetti's constant, social walls at 60. But recently I also saw that, South Korea is thinking about building 6 new transit lines at $99 billion to build a fertility wall, basically, so they can allow people to go home faster, right? It's like, this is the thing that came in my head, right? They were going to build 6 new high-speed lines to cut 60 minutes off commute so people could go home and have babies, right? So there's that wall, I guess. There might be better ways to get to that policy goal, but it's the wall that something people really do take to and they really think about. And so there's lots of ways to apply it and think about those walls. So how does talking about a wall get people to understand access or perk up a little bit more?
So the thing I brought to the discussion of access and accessibility, because isochrones, the blob, the idea of here's a person, draw the blob of where they could get to in a given amount of time, that's called an isochrone. That diagram as an idea has been around forever. I think what I have brought to this conversation is that metaphor, that the isochrone is a map of a wall. It is the wall around your life for certain purposes, because there is for any particular kind of thing we might want to do, there is an amount of time that we have in our day that we can reasonably devote to that. And if it cannot be done in that amount of time, we're not going to do it. And so that becomes a kind of freedom that we don't have, right? So I look at an isochrone, that image of you're here are all the places you could be. It is a map of freedom, or to put it more negatively, it is a description of, if you will, a sort of prison wall around your life, the wall that constrains what you can do. I find the metaphor very, very powerful, first of all, because it connects with how people talk about the way transportation affects their lives. People talk all the time about things they don't do because they can't get there. Opportunities in their lives that they don't experience because they can't get there, or because getting there would just take too long. So we're trying to put some numbers and some rigor to something that is very deeply felt by a lot of people, and to try to talk in a way that connects to people's feelings. Now, what's this replacing? I'm trying to take some bandwidth away from the reigning ideology, which says that ultimately everything the transportation planners do should be about pleasing a ridership model, because the prediction of ridership is the ultimate thing that measures our success. And the process of predicting ridership, like the process of predicting traffic or any sort of behavior, has two steps. There is a step of looking at the access that exists in a particular situation, but then there's a sort of social science step of looking at how people make decisions in the context of their options and guessing what people will do in the future. So what I want to do is just stop that process one step sooner and say, the access analysis, which has always been going on, hidden inside the ridership model where we can't see it, is what we want. So, for example, when I come into a community and the decision makers are having an argument about whether to build this project, and everyone has been told it will have 7,000 riders, and some people think that's a big number and some people think that's a small number, I wish they were not talking about that, because nobody actually knows how many riders that will be. That will be a prediction about human behavior. But what we do know is how it would transform where people can go. And so I wish they were saying things like, if we build this project, someone living here will be able to get to 60% more jobs. That would be a fact. And the important thing about that is that whereas ridership is a prediction, access is a fact about the present. Access is a fact about the possibilities in your life, and that is a fact about the present. And as a result, we're much more sure about it than we are about a ridership prediction. So I think that we, in general, in the profession, tend to overvalue prediction and use predictive language when that is not actually what we really want to talk about. And I think it's particularly what a lot of ordinary people outside of the profession want to talk about. I've encountered very few average people that I meet on the street or on the bus who actually care very much about the ridership prediction. They care about how this affects their lives.
It's interesting because I feel like if you're an elected official or you're a transit agency or you're in charge of how the money is spent, you want to break stuff down into these technical details or,
right,
ways that you can sell it to, legislature or whoever is making the decisions about the purse strings. And so it's interesting to think about the differences between what, normie riders would want versus the people maybe making decisions and what they're thinking about. Because all day they're probably, immersed in this soup of ridership data or thinking about, how much money we're actually going to get from the legislature for this project, or in California, for example, for transit service writ large, right? And
right.
So I think that that's an interesting way to think about it as well.
Mm-hmm. And so I really have come to feel that the conversation that we're having about ridership predictions is actually a very narrowly focused conversation for the purposes of pleasing certain funding authorities and satisfying certain people, but that is the wrong conversation to be having with most people, because most people don't care about that. And if you want votes, don't talk about ridership, talk about how we're expanding access to opportunity.
Along those same lines, I mean, the data and the data collection and just like the mapping technologies have taken off and are so easy to use now. I mean, what is the improvement in all that meant for how you discuss this stuff?
Oh, it's just so much less theoretical now, because we can do very subtle kinds of analysis. We can use access analysis in a network plan. We'll be using access analysis not just to talk in general about the average access to opportunity across the region and how that changes, but we can talk about how that changes for people of color, for low-income people, for any particular subgroup of equity concern. We can talk about it very easily. We can slice it by any geography that you care about. If you want to know how access changes from your council district counselor, there's a way to slice the data for that. So we just have a whole lot of ability to get precise about access and to tell stories. One of the most fun things, though, that we can do now, we've been doing this for a few years. I think we did the first one when we did the Dublin redesign back in 2017. When we're proposing some sort of change to the transit network, we can throw an access viewer up on the web. We can say, hey, go online. There's a map of your city. Pick a location, pick your house, pick your mother's house, pick whatever else you care about. And we'll show you blobs of where you can get to. And we'll show you how those blobs change in response to the proposal, right? So you can see from your own selfish point of view, oh, okay, I'd be able to shop over there now. I can't get to that grocery store now, but I'd be able to get to that grocery store. That's cool. You can see that in your blob. And one of the goals of that is, I know most people are going to give us input from a selfish point of view, and I'd like their selfish point of view to be more informed. I'd like their selfish point of view to be not just about how this affects what they're used to, which is what most comments are about, how this is changing something that I'm entitled to have never changed because I'm used to it. I would love for comments to be more about how this changes what I can do and to help people see the incredibly positive ways that this affects them. The Dublin plan, the draft report that we put out, the average Dubliner could get to 20% more useful destinations in half an hour. And you stop and think about that. Wow. When more precisely, we were looking at jobs and school enrollments, which are the things we have really good location data for in Ireland. And we were saying, so just think of that as kind of a proxy for all the other things you might want to go to. You can get to 20% more in half an hour. There's just more of the city is available to you if you're on public transport. And that draft, there were enormous campaigns of opposition on that draft. We had, there are some political parties that have trouble differentiating themselves, and so they tend to exaggerate small differences sometimes. We had one of the unions coming out against it. There was a whole lot of misinformation about it. But that was the thing that kept everyone focused on why this wasn't just a bad idea, because lots of people were complaining. And putting out the Isochrone viewer where people could look for themselves on how this expanded where they could go really helped.
How much anger have you absorbed over the last 10 to 13 years or so from folks who are upset about changes or things like that?
So the challenge of that question is that if I tell you that I have, in fact, absorbed it, I would be confessing to a fairly serious mental health problem, because no one can absorb the amount of anger that comes at you when you do this work. And if I were to tell you that I hadn't, I would be making myself sound like I'm heartless and don't care about the impacts of the plans that we have, which isn't true either. We understand from long experience that people are used to things being as they are, and their first reaction is to be angry when confronted with the possibility that things will change. And I think that it's easy to ridicule the NIMBY. It's easy to ridicule the opponent of change. And I, for that reason, am always noticing all the ways that I am doing this too. And I think we should all call ourselves out on all the ways that we are doing this too. Because I bet if you think about it, now and then you encounter things that you were used to, that are changing, that you think shouldn't have changed, and it irritates you. And that's NIMBYism, right? That's the heart of that whole sensation. And so what we start every project, a typical interaction is a client comes to us, hires us, wants a network design. They want more ridership. They want their network to be more relevant. And one of the early questions is basically, how much anger are you prepared to sit through? Because the level of anger will be proportional to how much we are changing. It won't be proportional to the quality of the plan. It'll be proportional to how much the plan changes things. Because the more we change things people are used to, the angrier people will be. So I always have to take every client through this process, not just at the staff level, but also at the level of the elected officials or policymakers. When we did the Houston redesign that went in 2015, the board hearings for that redesign lasted night after night after night, several evenings until midnight. Hundreds of people spoke, overwhelmingly opposed to the plan. Hundreds of people stood up over and over and told this board that if we implement this plan, we'll be in some way destroying their lives. Many of those people were over-dramatizing, but a few of those people were right. The network plan did go through and change things in a very dramatic way to make the network more relevant. And yes, that was going to be bad for some people who were used to the network as it was. There's no way to avoid that in the context of the very austere transit operations budgets that we're working with in the United States, somewhat different in Europe. So, I respect the anger, but I also anticipate the anger, and we plan for the anger from the beginning. And we are thinking from the beginning about how do we tell a story that makes it worth sitting through some anger to get to a good place.
Last time we chatted, we had a kind of a longer discussion about this and NIMBYs and the NIMBY mind and things like that, which was, I think, folks really took to. But in the book, you talk also about the mindset of people that do these stated preference surveys. And I was curious when I was reading, and I was like, do you feel like people can know of a preference if they haven't experienced it before?
That's the thing. Stated preference means doing surveys that ask people, what would you do if? And we're seeing these all the time right now in the election. How would learning this about this candidate change? And in the old days, you saw this a lot more. People were always asking, would you use a bus route that if it went from here to here? It's useless information. People can't. People don't know enough about hypothetical situations. And most people just are not good at thinking honestly about hypothetical situations. So I just don't find stated preference information to be very useful.
Since the book first came out, what's the most interesting or maybe unexpected response you've had from a reader about the concepts in the book?
I'm going to have trouble picking one, I think.
That's okay. Can do a couple if you want.
I think I'm going to have trouble with that question because there have been so many different responses. But honestly, most of what I've gotten a lot of emails of the form, your book is really interesting, but have you thought about this cool invention I'm working on that will change everything? I've gotten so many of those. Some of these people have actually hired me briefly as advisors, and I've sat down with them and talked with them a little while about their invention. And it's partly through that experience that I've become much more confident in my doctrinaire belief that, as I put it, technology never changes geometry, and that we need to be very clear that when we're talking about public transit, we're talking about the solution to a geometric problem, the efficient use of space in cities. And so there's been a great deal of that. And I think that the way that the new edition talks about technology is probably that. But I think the other thing is that the first edition, I think I found through the way my practice was continuing to go and the challenges that I was encountering, that I had not really gotten to the heart of what I mean by access, and that I needed to do more work on that. And the second edition is the fruit of another decade's work on that.
Geometry is key to a lot of the discussions. And last week we were talking with Megan Kimball, who recently released a book about highways in Texas. And, she brought up some interesting history, which is that, General Bragdon reported to President Eisenhower in the 50s and 60s how the funds for the highway system were being spent on cities and blowing up the budget because they were going through cities instead of to cities. And, basically he brought this report. He said the best way to serve cities would be with mass transit. And Eisenhower, I guess, believed it, but then he put it aside because he wanted Nixon to be elected. Eventually, JFK got elected instead. But geometry is a known quantity. It's been known for a long time. And this report in the 50s to the president, it spelled that out as well. And so I'm wondering why it's hard to understand it now, or why is it hard for people to understand it now? It's something that's a constant.
The day before yesterday, I had a guest from Europe, and we went up on the hills here in Portland to a place where we could look out over the city. And we looked down at the city, and it was PM rush hour. And there was the freeway in front of us through the middle of the city, and the freeway loop around downtown, all completely plugged with cars, all completely plugged with red lights. And the freeway bridge across the river and the freeway viaduct that walls off the east bank of the river, all plugged with cars, basically parked. All that infrastructure taking up that extraordinarily valuable land and the extraordinary opportunity costs of, having a wall down the east side of the river instead of a city there, all to serve really a microscopic number of people when you count, what's in those cars. And what happened, as well as I can understand it, was an instructive example of what I call the fishing pier problem of equity, or the fishing pier problem of fairness. And it goes like this. This is not in the book. Imagine a coastal city like Chicago, and imagine that they've gotten some money together to build some fishing piers. And so, like a good study, they do a fishing pier distribution study. And they develop a plan for fishing piers. And all the fishing piers that are proposed are in the wealthy neighborhoods on the lake. And people who live away from the lake in less wealthy neighborhoods, would they rise up and say, wait a minute, where are our fishing piers? And they wouldn't, because they would understand that fishing piers only make sense on bodies of water. And that the notion that you can just distribute something equitably by neighborhood without regard to the more fundamental physical facts of the matter is something that people would understand. Well, this is happening with transportation all the time. And freeways through cities are a great example of the fishing pier fallacy. So a new kind of transportation thing was invented, the freeway. And it was really, really good as a form of transportation between cities and around the edges of cities, which is exactly how they're used in Europe. That's what the European freeway system looks like. There's a big loop around the end of each city, and there's a freeway that goes off that loop to the next city, but they don't come into the city. So you had these representatives from the inner cities who were saying, but this is the cool new thing. Where's ours? And the answer was, it's like asking for a fishing pier when you're not on the lake. This fishing pier is not going to do for you what it would do over there because you're in a different place and you're not, and it's not because you're not a good person. It's because of geometry. It's not because of who you are. It's because of where you are and the geometry of where you live. That because you're in a high density place, freeways will not work for you. They will all be plugged all the time. They will do enormous destruction to your city, and then they will be plugged all the time and not even be all that useful. So it's just interesting that, that original epic catastrophic mistake about building urban freeways in the U.S. is of the same shape as so many little mistakes that are being made now. They're getting microtransit in their suburb. Why aren't we getting microtransit downtown? Because you have a fixed route network downtown. But microtransit is the cool new thing. We don't want these old fixed routes. No, microtransit is a tool for a particular set of situations which are not your situation. That's the endless challenge. That's the fishing pier problem.
What's the pandemic done to the discussions that you have?
Prior to the pandemic, transit agencies were under the very heavy influence of rush hour commuters with their briefcases and laptops, demanding very expensive, specialized, high-quality choice rider services into downtown. One of the reasons that the whole conversation has become, for me, a little easier since the pandemic is that many of those people went away. And what we got instead was a new conversation about equity. And to me, that is just an invitation to say what I've been saying all along, which is that we will do great transit planning when we focus on the lower to middle 80 to 90% and not as much on the tastes of people in relatively elite positions in society. That's a challenge, of course, because of who the decision makers are. But equity is a sort of blunt instrument, but a tool that, makes it possible, and creates the space to have those conversations. And I think these conversations have been easier because the rush hour commuter has to some extent disappeared. Now, what this means, I don't want to make it sound like it's all good for transit agencies. Transit agencies that were financially and institutionally locked into the rush hour commute, like commuter railroads, have had a terrible time. Transit agencies whose primary justification was that. But the silver lining has been that you've seen some extraordinary innovation now in repurposing transit services and transit infrastructure to be more useful all day. I'm working right now on a project for PACE in the suburbs of Chicago, so I've had occasion to study the timetables of the Chicago suburban rail system, Metra. vastly more useful services now than there were before the pandemic, when the Metro was overwhelmingly focused on just how do we move as many trains into Chicago at 8 a.m. as we can. Metro has done everything they can in the context of their constraints to run a two-way consistent frequency that is useful for all of the many, many other kinds of travel that's happening. And ultimately, what this is doing is helping transit agencies not just focus on a more diverse customer, but also, frankly, do something that is just much more efficient for them to do in the long run. The one-way peak express service is just about the most inefficient thing transit can do. Even if the bus or train is full, it's a bus or train that you had to buy and own and store, but maybe use only once a day. It's a driver that had to work a short shift that you'll have to pay extra for. It may have gone full in one direction, but it went back empty in the other direction. Just all kinds of inefficiencies that we're able to get away from now with less emphasis on that overwhelming rush hour commute. Some transit agencies are in a very difficult place financially, and I certainly don't minimize the fiscal cliffs. Another thing that's happening is that labor is becoming more expensive. We're going to have to pay bus drivers more. And I'm fine with that because it's a very difficult job, and I want to hold them to high standards, and I want people to be wanting to do that difficult job. But it does mean that we are going to be going to voters in many cities with, new realities about what transit can do, but also, what it means to run a good transit system. So we're in the midst of many of those conversations.
I find it interesting too, though, that a lot of these agencies, especially like BART, were lauded because they had such a high fare box recovery. Mm-hmm. And so now, with work from home and the collapse of downtown commutes during the end of the week, as well as, midweek too, now they're in a hole. And so you go from this vaunted status to albatross. And I find that really interesting because, beforehand they were told that this is the way to go and this is what the best thing to do would be. And now it's something that's hanging around their neck.
And so a lot of reinvention needs to be happening to get focused on not just the markets we have now, but the kinds of growth we can expect in the future. Lots of people, especially at the upper end of the income spectrum, are going to continue working from home. I think there's no question. It's much less of a thing in Europe, interestingly, and I think the difference, of course, is that many more Americans, especially upscale Americans, have nice houses that they like spending the time in, and actually had the experience during the pandemic that this was kind of nice and are just not going to go back. So, I think the future of downtowns that had become over-dependent on the single economy of the office is, of course, housing and housing conversions that make those more interesting and diverse places. And that over time, I'm sure in 10 or 20 years, downtown San Francisco will again be a vibrant and active place, but it will be a vibrant and active place because a lot more people live there. And the journey to that is obviously going to be rough and difficult, and transit agencies are going to need a lot of help because ultimately we're still going to need them as much as we ever did. And ultimately, those tighter mixes of housing and activity all over the place, getting away from the rigid single-use zoning that did so much damage to our cities in the 20th century, that's really going to take us in a direction that makes transit more and more efficient because it means people going back and forth all day. It means people using the train in both directions at the same time. All those things that, you just did not get with the single overwhelming office core.
In the book, and one of the things you address this time that was not even on the radar previously is the fare-free movement and the folks who are asking about, whether we should, basically get rid of fares and make transit free. And I'm curious, how that discussion has evolved in your mind, but also what some of the language that's used. It's a very sticky topic, but it's also kind of like a way for people to talk about frequency and other things, but not really talk about it at the same time.
Well, I think here's the problem. I had to write the book because transit service is something that needs some explaining. Prices, the concept of prices needs no explaining. Everyone understands. But the concept of service takes quite a bit of explaining because it's not quite what you assume it is, and it doesn't work quite like however you assume it works based on whatever frame of reference you're coming from. That makes all the difference. Now, we have seen over and over, both studies, surveys, but also, revealed evidence that ridership responds much more to service than it does to fare. And that quality service is the thing that makes the difference. As a result, given the level of dependence on fares that American transit agencies have in big city, and I'm talking about big city agencies now, like BART, simply eliminating fares is the same thing as massively cutting service. So for that reason, the places that have actually done this experiment with various degrees of permanence are very specific kinds of places. Even before the pandemic, university towns were doing it, and that's typically because they already had a deal by which the university paid for passes for their students, and then that was 90% of the ridership, and it wasn't worth the trouble to collect fares from the rest. Chapel Hill, North Carolina, places like that, college towns. Rural areas were often sometimes fare-free for the same reason. The ridership is so low, the fare revenue is so low, it's just not worth the costs of handling fares, the security, cash handling, all that. And there have been free rural systems in the state of Washington for a long time. So immediately after the pandemic, a whole bunch of transit agencies kind of temporarily went into that condition where their ridership was so low, their fare revenue was so low, they started wondering whether it was worth it. And so some cities like Kansas City and Albuquerque have eliminated fares. And I think that was the right decision at the time in their situation. I expect that if those transit agencies grow in relevance and improve their services, they will eventually reach a point where it does not make sense to continue being free. But in big cities, there's no way to do it. And even in Europe, nobody really does it. There are small college towns that do it. There have been little experiments. There was the big experiment in Tallinn, Estonia, which found very little benefit in terms of actually shifting people out of cars. I understand why it's popular, because it's easy to explain, and service is hard to explain, and that makes a big difference right there. But ultimately, service matters more than fare. I also think, by the way, that it makes good sense to have low-income discounts so that people who are more sensitive to cost pay less. Entirely supportive of those. Many cities are doing those. But I think that simply, putting forward free fares as a solution to anything is, in big city systems, is just not going to work in the context of how our cities work and how our transit agencies are funded.
Yeah, I can't imagine large cities or places like San Francisco coming up with, millions and millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars for that fare revenue, even though it's such a small percentage of total compared to like what BART was, I guess. But it's interesting to think about. Last question. What's interesting to you right now?
Well, Europe is interesting to me right now because we're doing more work there and we're getting more involved in European conversations in European markets. And one of the things that's been sort of one of the most interesting things to discover in the last year or two is that I can go over to Europe as an American and there are useful things we can offer. There are useful aspects to how American cities organize public transit and things that we achieve that are, in fact, helpful to Europeans. And I think that access analysis is one of those things, because the default European approach, which is also the approach I dealt with, that was the reigning approach when I was in Australia and New Zealand a decade ago, is one that's very much rooted in prediction and modeling and rooted in also the metaphor of business. You sit down for 5 minutes with any transport planner in the UK or Australia, and you'll hear the word business case over and over. They're used to talking about everything on a metaphor of business. And I think that one of the strengths of the American transit industry is that we don't talk about it that way. We aren't obliged to pretend that we are some sort of failing business. We're not a business at all. We're something else. We're essential infrastructure. We're essential service. So I think that's one thing that's I've been enjoying the time I've been spending in Europe and the time I've been spending with European transit planners and, learning about their perspectives. So, for example, just the other day, I had a guest from Spain who visited me here in Portland. And there were things that were just impossible to explain to me. Like, there's a very funny place in Portland in the Pearl District, which is the very upscale, dense neighborhood that was built around the streetcar, where there is standing a single brick wall braced up with metal girders the way you would brace a ruin of, an ancient Greek temple or something, to make it stand up. But it was just a brick wall of like an early 20th century warehouse that was just standing there. The windows open, grass, trees growing visible through the windows. And I could not explain to my European guest that it would make sense in America to just keep a wall of a building, not even 100 years old, and then dress it up as though it were a ruin, all in order to screen a parking lot, which is behind it, which is the real thing we're doing there. So there were funny things like that. We went to a suburban transit center. We went to Beaverton Transit Center, which is a fairly typical American suburban transit center. It has a little building in the center with a person selling coffee and has a huge amount of asphalt around it where lots of buses cycle around it at the station. And he said, "This looks like Switzerland." And so there are just all these moments when it's like, wait a minute, Beaverton looks like Switzerland to someone from Spain. There's a whole bunch of information there about Spain, about Switzerland, about Beaverton. And I'm just having a lot of fun discovering all of those differences between European countries.
Is it because Mount Hood's in the background?
No.
No.
No, it's because of the amount of space that there is and the amount of architecture that there is, which in Spain, generally, you will not see that sort of big bus hub. You'll see buses just meeting on the street however they can meet. But Spain has tended not to create those kinds of facilities.
Interesting.
You tend to see things sort of shoehorned in wherever they can. But anyway, I'm enjoying that very much. I am very excited by the future of an American transit industry that is allowed to focus on the lower to middle 90%. And I think that where that industry is going, to the extent that's able to maintain some political support, there's a lot of great promise. And just as I think there's a lot of great promise in the kinds of cities that we're having to build now. So that's what I'm interested in.
I'm also excited, I think, because after, being around for 20 plus years or so and thinking about these issues, you can be down about it because doesn't have the political support of highways and things like that. But there's been a lot of innovation and a lot of change and a lot of really cool stuff happening. Mm-hmm. I mean, Van Ness BRT here in San Francisco, for example, it took a long time, but when it finished, it was really cool, right? It does some great things. So,
you know why they call them the 49ers in San Francisco?
I do.
Because the Transit First Ordinance was adopted in 1973, and the Van Ness BRT that implemented it finally opened in 2022, 49 years.
And it runs the 49 bus. Well, the book is Human Transit, second edition, How Clearer Thinking About Public Transit Can Enrich Our Communities and Our Lives. Jarrett, where can folks find the book if they want to get a copy?
Oh, all the usual places. I encourage you to go down to your local physical bookstore and ask them for it, because merely the act of asking them for it will encourage them to stock it, whether or not you have the patience to buy it from them. But of course, all the usual online sources as well.
Well, Jarrett, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and appears first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters for supporting this show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. Sign up for our 18-year-old daily newsletter by visiting TheOverheadWire.com or check the show notes for other cool merch and opportunities to connect. Follow along using your podcatcher of choice, but if you can't find it there, you can always find the show at its original home, usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.